A study published in Nature Communications looked at over 40,000 MRI scans and found something that completely changes how we actually think about belly fat and visceral fat and what it actually does. Based on that research, we can now identify the literal worst offenders for visceral fat accumulation, and we're going to get to the specific foods that talk about that in just a second. When we actually dive into the research, it gets super wild. Visceral fat, which is the fat that's around your organs, was linked to a super high likelihood of cardiometabolic disease, but abdominal subcutaneous fat, like the stuff that's right under the skin in your belly, that stuff you can pinch. That didn't show the same risk, okay? Like most of us know that. But it gets even more interesting. The fat that's around the hips might actually be protective. So it isn't about losing weight per se. I mean, that's usually important, but it's about where your body decides to store it, and food can influence that. So today I'm going to show you 5 things, foods and drinks that funnel fat inward towards that visceral region over time. And then after that, we're going to walk through what actually reverses that. And we're going to talk about the exact studies and the mechanisms. So here's what we're going to cover. First, I'm going to explain why visceral fat behaves differently than the fat that's under your skin, why it's more inflammatory, why it's more connected to insulin resistance. Secondly, we're going to break down the 5 things that nudge your body towards storing fat viscerally. Okay, this is a slow process, doesn't happen overnight. It happens over months and years, and it's just how the body sort of starts reallocating. Then I'm going to give you a really practical set of takeaways. We're going to talk realistic strategies that are shown to reduce visceral fat. In fact, there was a study that I'm going to talk about that dropped visceral fat by 33% in 8 weeks. We're going to talk about how to handle fructose without becoming afraid of fruit, because fructose can play a role with visceral fat. Something that might be helpful when it comes to visceral fat accumulation or reducing it is understanding how the microbiome works, because a lot of why we store visceral fat is inflammation related. Much of that starts in our gut. So I put a link 20% off your first order of seed down below for a product called Seed. It is a symbiotic, so it's a prebiotic and a probiotic combined into one capsule. It's really interesting technology, but they have a lot of clinical studies to back it up. They're able to back up how the prebiotic breaks down first, and then the capsule that's inside the outside capsule then travels further down and helps colonize the bacteria where it needs to go. So you're getting a very strategic release of the bacteria and the prebiotics at the same time. It's really interesting. So that link gets you 20% off Seed's Daily Symbiotic. Again, this is something, it's a great place to start if you're revamping your diet. So I highly recommend you check them out. Top line of the description underneath this video. So let's break visceral versus subcutaneous fat down. Why visceral fat is a completely different beast. Because until the 1990s, fat was treated like inert storage. It just sits there holding calories, somewhat benign, unless there's too much of it. But our understanding changed kind of overnight when we had some research. They found that adipose tissue secretes hormones and these signaling molecules. And some of that can be beneficial, like good healthy fat on you can be beneficial. Like subcutaneous fat can secrete leptin, which is a satiety hormone, and it helps regulate appetite and can stimulate energy expenditure. But we're not talking a ton of jiggly fat. We're talking just a little bit of subcutaneous fat. But the issue is that in obesity, you end up with leptin resistance, okay? So that's a regulatory signal that gets impaired. Different story for a different day. Visceral fat takes this whole thing to an entirely different level. Visceral fat is located around the intestines, and it likely evolved as a barrier, almost like an immune buffer for bacteria and particles that leak from the gut. So it had a purpose. In fact, there was a paper that was published in PNES, and this paper was called Nutrition, the Visceral Immune System, and the Evolutionary Origins of Pathogenic Obesity that explains this concept. Like the title just spells it out, right? So visceral fat houses immune cells. It houses macrophages. Okay, that's helpful in a really acute infection. But when there's constant leakage of bacterial particles, like what's called LPS, lipopolysaccharides from the gut, those macrophages stay activated. So what that really means is that visceral fat can behave like a chronic inflammation factory, and it actually gets worse beyond that. Visceral fat cells also secrete inflammatory cytokines. So we got TNF-alpha, we got IL-6, which intensify that entire inflammatory state in the whole body, not just locally. So if you've ever wondered why belly fat and insulin resistance seem glued together, this is a big reason why. Visceral fat is also linked to these really high levels of what's called RBP4, retinol binding protein 4, which is considered a causal factor in insulin resistance because it inhibits insulin receptors from receiving the signal in skeletal muscle. So it's actually stopping insulin from doing its job. So visceral fat isn't just extra storage, it's actually metabolically active, immunologically active, and it feeds into insulin resistance. And this is why scientists care so much about central fatness so much. It's a real thing that we need to worry about. And there was a massive meta-analysis that was published in the British Medical Journal, looked at 72 studies, over 2.5 million participants, and it showed that not all fat is equal. So larger thigh and hip circumference was associated with lower risk of death, but increased central fatness increased mortality risk significantly. So the question ends up becoming, what are the foods and the 5 of the biggest contributors to visceral fat drinks that push fat storage towards the center? And this is where things can go wrong Because most people focus on just calories, which is important, but they ignore partitioning, and they ignore the important stuff that could really be causing visceral fat in the first place. So first up is trans fats. We got things like hydrogenated soybean oil, trans fats in general. There's a really well-designed study that was published in Obesity that looked at trans fatty acids in 42 monkeys over 6 years. And I know it's in monkeys, but trust me, it's important with this because it's one of the best ways we were able to get as close to human data with a pretty detailed study that would be hard to do in humans. And it wasn't an unrealistic dose. It was 8% of total energy intake of trans fats, which the researchers estimated could look like about 15 to 20 grams of trans fats per day for a regular human eating regular ultra-processed food. Not that hard to consume that. So they used hydrogenated soybean oil, which is a common industrial source. And the beauty of the study is that the control diet was perfectly matched. The only difference was trans fats versus monounsaturated fats. So over time, the monkeys that were eating the trans fats gained significantly more visceral fat, and they showed impaired glucose metabolism. And what that really means is that trans fats didn't just make them gain weight. The trans fats shifted where the fat went. So what we learned from this is that trans fats are a slow, sneaky shove in the wrong direction. And over years, they really matter. So with trans fats aside, let's move into a bigger modern umbrella, okay, which is simply ultra-processed foods. But there's reality here that has more detail than just a blanket statement, okay? There was a study that was published in Clinical Nutrition. They looked at 1,485 older Spaniards, and it assessed their visceral fat accumulation alongside ultra-processed food intake. They divided intake into tertiles. Ultra-processed food was defined as these formulations made with several ingredients, little to no fresh foods and processes that break down the food matrix. So soft drinks, packaged snacks, packaged meats, like processed meat, these pre-prepared meals and just stuff like that. In the lowest tertile, ultra-processed food consumption was only about 2.73% of total grams of food. Medium was about 5.97% of total food. High was about 15.6%. And keep in mind, this is Spain, okay? They eat much less processed food than America. In America, it's like 60, 70, even 80% in some places. So higher ultra-processed food intake was clearly associated with higher visceral fat. But this is the part that made me pause a little bit. There was a study that was published in the British Medical Journal that reported that in the United States, on average, we're looking around 60% of energy intake coming from ultra-processed foods. So if you compare that to older Spaniards, even the high tertile, the US average intake is astronomical. Now is all that because of trans fats? Not necessarily, but we do have a strong mechanistic bridge in that research, and that's the microbiome. Like I mentioned earlier, diets high in really ultra-processed foods are associated with huge microbiome dysbiosis, not just like a small amount. There was work published in the journal Nutrition that reviewed how ultra-processed foods impact the gut microbiome. You've got emulsifiers, you've got preservatives, you've got colorants, you've got antibiotic residues from low-quality meat. All these things disrupt microbial communities. Then you have a super strong study in the International Journal of Obesity that profiled gut microbiomes in almost 900 people, and they measured visceral fat using a very accurate thing called a DEXA scan. And what they found is that decreased microbial diversity, so just a less prolific microbiome, was completely associated with increases in visceral fat. So what that really means is that your gut ecosystem is one of the signals that tells your body whether it's in a store inward and inflamed state or not. Now that we understand how ultra-processed foods can reshape the gut and kind of push us towards visceral fat, the next piece is sodas. So soda is technically ultra-processed, but the evidence here is super clean, so we can keep it separate. There was a study published in the Journal of Nutrition that looked at sugars, sweetened beverages, and they looked at over 2,500 middle-aged adults. So it's a lot of data that they looked at here. They found that daily consumption had significantly greater visceral fat than non-consumers. But then there was another study in obesity that showed the same pattern and found the effects seemed to hit visceral fat specifically, not subcutaneous fat. So why would soda specifically push fat inward viscerally? Well, research with this proposed a few mechanisms, and one of the most important things is a fat partitioning through something called lipoprotein lipase. Normally, this LPL enzyme is in subcutaneous fat, and normally its activity in subcu fat is more sensitive to insulin than LPL inside visceral fat. So insulin tends to push storage more towards subcutaneous fat. But with insulin resistance, subcutaneous fat becomes less responsive and more of those fatty acids get stored viscerally. So the more insulin resistant you are, the more soda causes visceral fat. And then you add fructose into the equation. Fructose can activate glucocorticoids like cortisol, okay? And cortisol can also activate lipoprotein lipase as well. So you have a double whammy. Visceral fat has a higher concentration of glucocorticoid receptors than subcutaneous fat, so that makes it more sensitive to those signals, which can be really catastrophic. So what that means is that soda is more than just empty calories. It's a signaling cocktail, if you want to call it that. You have insulin resistance plus cortisol signaling. That is what's moving the fat to want to store inward. So it's not just a calorie discussion anymore. There was a study published in the Journal of Clinical Investigation, And it found that beverages that were sweetened with pure glucose didn't affect visceral fat or insulin sensitivity, but drinks that were sweetened with pure fructose consumed for 10 weeks decreased insulin sensitivity and increased visceral fat. So something different is happening there that sets us up perfectly for the next category, which is fruit juice. And I know guys like Paul Saladino might disagree on this, but I think for metabolically unhealthy people, this is real because people will think that juice is natural, it's fruit, it's fine. But the research makes a really crucial point here. Fruit juices can contain more fructose than soda because they contain free fructose and glucose in proportions that skew really high and abnormal, right? So if we look at a study in nutrition, it reported that fructose made up 60% of sugars in a lot of these beverages and these sugar-sweetened beverages. But they also made up 52% in high fructose corn syrup beverages and 67% in 100% fruit juices. There is more fructose in that than a lot of sugar-sweetened beverages. And the juices that were highest in fructose, we had things like grape juice, we had pomegranate juice, apple and pear juice. Okay, so normal juices, the research explicitly says that those should be avoided or consumed very rarely, if you really look at the data. In the solution section, I'm going to talk about fructose from fruit because the data is a little bit better and very reassuring. But for now, there's a really key point here. Juice is fructose delivered without the breaks, without the fiber that regulates intake, which brings us to the fifth and final category, which is alcohol. And it's not called a beer belly for no reason. There was a study in the Annals of Nutrition and Metabolism that assessed body composition in almost 1,000 healthy people using legit CT scans. So it can distinguish visceral fat and sub-Q fat. Higher alcohol intake was associated with huge differences, way more visceral fat mass. The study also found that people consuming more than 14 standard drinks per week had a higher risk of metabolic syndrome. So one standard drink was defined as about 12 grams of ethanol, which is roughly maybe like a 10 to 12 ounce beer or like a glass of wine, like 5 ounces of wine. Then there was another study that was published in the World Journal of Gastrointestinal Pharmacology. And this one found that women who drink frequently were at higher risk storing fat as visceral fat than men. So women actually store more visceral fat from alcohol than men do. That's interesting. And there's a lot of studies that actually suggest that the type of alcohol matters. For example, beer is worse than wine or liquor, probably because of the estrogenic component. So those are the 5. We've got trans fats, we've got ultra-processed foods, we've got sugar-sweetened beverages, we've got fruit juice, and we've got alcohol. But I want to give you strategies and solutions, practical solutions that might be able to help you navigate it so that you don't end up down a vicious cycle. So the first takeaway, target visceral fat on purpose, okay? Don't just chase the scale. Remember how we opened with that Nature Communications MRI analysis? Only visceral fat tracked with higher cardiometabolic disease risk. Abdominal subcutaneous fat didn't show the same association. So what that means is that you can make meaningful health progress even if the scale doesn't plummet, as long as visceral fat is moving. That's why the strategies that I'm about to give you can focus on changing the signals that visceral fat responds to. I also want you to use a structured eating pattern that reduces visceral fat without relying on perfection. There's a study in obesity that compared intermittent fasting with something called protein pacing versus a calorie restriction diet that was based on a particular cholesterol education program. So they had 200 participants. The calorie restriction group followed that diet with 35% fat, 60% carbs, a low cholesterol, 20-30 grams of fiber. Fasting group did either one fasting day per week, about 36 hours, or 2 consecutive days, about 60 hours, where they still had 400 calories. So it wasn't like a real fast. It was more so designed for adherence with low calorie. But the real magic is what they did on the non-fasting days. They didn't just eat whatever. They ate around 1,800 calories per day with a very high protein distribution. So it's 35% protein, which is high compared to the other. 35% carbs, 30% fat, all in split into 4 meals with 20 to 40 g of protein each meal. That's called protein pacing. And the key point with this is that the diets were designed to be isocaloric, the same exact amount of calories. So both groups improved their weight loss, they improved their fat mass, their visceral fat, their blood pressure, their blood lip, it's all improved. So calorie restriction worked, but intermittent fasting plus protein pacing worked better because there was a 33% decrease in the combined approach versus 14% in calorie restriction alone in just 8 weeks when it came to visceral fat. They preserved more lean mass and they overall just had a better quality of life with their diet. It was more sustainable. What was also important is that the desire to eat decreased by 17% in the combined group while it stayed about the same in the calorie restriction group. And then there was a study in nutrition and metabolism that highlights protein satiety effect because protein tends to promote satiety more than carbs or fat. It's pretty common knowledge now. The mechanisms aren't totally settled, but the outcome is consistent. Higher protein tends to make it easier to adhere. And what that means is that you're not just forcing willpower, you're actually able to change these appetite signals. Thirdly, if you want more of a lifestyle pattern, use a Mediterranean approach. There was a study in BMC that looked at an optimized high polyphenol Mediterranean diet, and they recruited 294 participants, and the intervention was a year and a half, which is really big for sustainability. They compared 3 groups: a healthy dietary guidelines group, a standard Mediterranean diet, and a high polyphenol Mediterranean diet. The high polyphenol group boosted polyphenol intake with some green tea a few times per day, and there was another green plant shake from Monai, which is a type of plant common in Asia, so high antioxidant polyphenol. A quick note on this though, you can focus on just eating high polyphenol foods like dark berries, dark chocolate, coffee, tea, some nuts like walnuts. Pecans are good. Flax, turmeric, artichoke, okay? But in this particular study, they found that adding the green plant shake from the Monai added 800 milligrams of polyphenols per day. So that was a pretty significant amount. And here's why this was really powerful, is really important. Because the healthy dietary guidelines group didn't lose weight, but their visceral fat area decreased by 4.2%. The standard Mediterranean group lost 2.7% body weight and reduced visceral fat by 6%. The high polyphenol Mediterranean group lost 3.9% body weight, but visceral fat tissue by 14%. So it wasn't dramatic amounts of weight loss on the scale, but how it was allocated was huge because there was substantial visceral fat improvement. And that's the point that I'm trying to make, is that visceral fat is not just about calories, okay? We're able to target the dangerous fat by having a completely different approach. Higher blood polyphenols correlated with more visceral fat loss. And 2 really important markers stood out for us here. There were higher hippuric acid levels, which are associated with visceral fat loss. Okay, hippuric acid is a byproduct of microbial metabolism. So things with forest berries, prunes, green tea, all this stuff can increase this. And then they also saw associations with urolithin, which is in pomegranates, it's in berries, some teas. And it isn't saying that like hippuric acid or urolithin is magic, but the microbiome processing of these polyphenols is a huge part of the story, which links right back to that whole gut visceral fat immune system access that I mentioned earlier. So we have to pay attention to the quality, not just the quantity. Then fourthly, you have to build these gut signals that can support fat oxidation. Fiber is a huge lever. So fiber matters for a lot of the indirect reasons. You have better blood sugar, better satiety, lower inflammation. But there was a study in microbiome that found that habitual fiber intake was associated with baseline short-chain fatty acid concentrations that were much higher. That tells us that fiber feeds the bacteria in our gut that ferments into these metabolites. There was an obesity research paper looking at CT scans over the course of 5 years, and they looked at 1,000 people, and they found that for every 10-gram increase in soluble fiber, visceral fat accumulation dropped by almost 4%. Okay, here's the mechanism though. There's a paper in the Journal of Lipid Research that showed that short-chain fatty acids regulate the balance between fatty acid synthesis and fatty acid oxidation, and also lipolysis. So fatty acid oxidation is activated by these short-chain fatty acids as a result of microbial diversity. Then there was a POS1 study that looked at acetic acid. Okay, this is a short-chain fatty acid. They found that on muscle cells, it activated EMPK. So it increased fatty acid uptake and glucose uptake. Then there's also research in the journal Gut that showed that butyrate, which is a byproduct of, again, breaking down fiber, can reduce appetite and activate brown adipose tissue through this gut-brain neural circuit. And what that means in simple plain language is that fiber feeds your gut bacteria. It's not just about making you poo. Your gut bacteria produce these short-chain fatty acids, and they act like metabolic signals that push your body towards burning fat, particularly visceral fat, and improve insulin sensitivity and inflammation along the way. So if you think of fiber like supplying raw materials to a factory, like you're just providing it with what it needs, you don't directly eat the final product, okay? The factory, in this case, your microbiome, turns it into these signals that tell your metabolism what mode to run in.